A great time to really be showing the autumn colors and thinking about the election is the most appropriate thing we could talk about today. So, I think we're live now, and it's my pleasure to welcome all those who are listening to us today. My name is Robert Baines. I am the president of the Association of Canada, an NGO dedicated to informing Canadians about the value of security and the importance of NATO. We remind Canadians that they're part of an alliance of many nations with the goal to maintain peace through strength. NATO adheres to a simple imperative that an attack upon one is an attack upon all. However, of course, vision, trust, and an understanding of the benefits of a non-zero-sum collaboration. After 71 years, we're now faced with questions about the future of the alliance, in part based on the possible outcomes of the US election. To discuss what the future might look like, we have a spectacular panel, and I'm absolutely pleased to introduce you to our moderator, Vincent Boucher, who is a PhD candidate and fellow at the Center for the United States Studies at the University of Quebec in Montreal. He is also the co-author of the upcoming book, National Security Entrepreneurs and the Making of American Foreign Policy. That's from McGill Queen's University Press. Vincent, you want to take us away and introduce our panel, and we'll get this discussion going.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baines. Thank you for inviting me to moderate this discussion. I want to also thank Chloe Kettels, who's a program editor at NAOC, for organizing the event. It's a great privilege for me to be here today with a distinguished set of speakers. It's a very timely discussion because we're going to have the first presidential debate tonight in Cleveland, Ohio. If you are as passionate as we are about foreign policy, you might be a bit disappointed by tonight's debate because with all the domestic issues that are pressing at this moment, like the COVID-19 pandemic, racial injustices, civil unrest, and President Trump's tax returns that just got out with the New York Times, there might be little time left to discuss foreign policy issues tonight, leave alone NATO. Yet I can guarantee you one thing, it's that you won't be disappointed by our discussion because we're going to go in depth on the topic of NATO. We're going to analyze the consequences, the potential consequences of the 2020 presidential elections on the future of NATO and on the future of US foreign policy. It is a great privilege for me to have the opportunity to introduce our three distinguished speakers. I will start with Dr. Anessa Kimball. Dr. Kimball is an associate professor of political science at Université Laval. Professor Kimball is director of the Center for International Security at the École supérieure d'études internationales at Université Laval, as well as one of the co-directors of security within the Canadian Defense and Security Network. In her research, Dr. Kimball employs quantitative methods to study international defense and security cooperation, as well as the design of defense and security arrangements using rational institutionalist and delegation approaches. Her work on international alliances has appeared in the Journal of Peace Research and in the International Journal. In 2018, she published a book chapter on the legal and institutional features of the NORAD agreement and its adaptation for strategic defense. This chapter appeared in a very interesting edited volume entitled North American Defense in the 21st Century. In her most recent publication, which is very interesting for the topic of our discussion, Dr. Kimball examines NATO at 70 years. This paper was released as part of the University of Calgary's School of Public Policy Research Paper Series. It's a great read, and I strongly recommend that you have a look at it and you take the time to consult it. Thank you for joining us for this discussion today on NATO, Dr. Kimball. I will continue with our second speaker, Dr. Darrell Bricker. Dr. Bricker is the global CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, a polling, research, marketing, and analysis company. He holds a PhD in political science from Carleton University and a BA and MA from Wilfrid Laurier University. He has been awarded an honorary Doctor of Laws degree by Wilfrid Laurier University, which also named him one of their top 100 graduates in the last 100 years. Dr. Bricker is also a research fellow with the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto and at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo. He has written 7 national best-selling books. That is quite an accomplishment. You should definitely check out his latest publication entitled Next, Where to Live, What to Buy, and Who Will Lead Canada's Future, which is a major release for HarperCollins Canada in 2020. Dr. Bricker is also a popular public speaker who regularly engages with audiences around the world. I had the opportunity to watch one of his talks online on global demographic trends with John Ibbitson, and I really enjoyed it. I strongly recommend that you have a look at this talk. Dr. Bricker has written articles for publication as diverse as Canada's Globe and Mail and France's Le Monde. He has also appeared on television and radio with all of Canada's major national networks and around the world with the news broadcast organizations such as CNN, the BBC, and NPR. Dr. Bricker, that is important to mention, is also one of NAOC's NATO champions, and he is a regular collaborator of the organization. Last but not the least, Mr. Jim Townsend is an adjunct senior fellow in the CNAS Transatlantic Security Program and was recently elected president of the Atlantic Treaty Association. Before joining CNAS, Mr. Townsend spent 8 years as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO Policy under the Obama administration. That assignment completed more than 34 years of work primarily on European and NATO policy in the Pentagon, at NATO, and at the Atlantic Council. His impressive career spanned the Cold War, the post-Cold War, sorry about that, spanned the Cold War, the post-Cold War, political reconstruction in Europe, and Europe's new challenges, including Russia and terrorism. Through his work, he has helped execute U.S. military engagement in almost every conflict from the Gulf War to the reintroduction of U.S. forces into Europe to deter Russia. He has also played critical roles in NATO enlargement, NATO reform, and helping to build bilateral defense relations with the new democracies coming from the breakup of the Soviet Union. Before becoming DASD in 2009, Mr. Townsend also served as Vice President in the Atlantic Council of the United States and Director of the Council's Program on International Security. He joined the Atlantic Council in 2006 after a distinguished civil service career at the Pentagon and at NATO. In the 1990s, Mr. Townsend was the Principal Director of European and NATO Policy, the Director of NATO Policy, and Director of the Defense Plans Division at the U.S. Mission to NATO in Brussels. He was also an adjunct professor of international studies at American University and taught at many institutions in the US and abroad. One last very important thing, Mr. Townsend is the co-host of Brussels Sprouts, a podcast on transatlantic security, Russia, and European politics. He and his colleague, Andrea Kendall-Taylor, just launched their new season with an episode featuring an interview with former US Ambassador to NATO, Nicholas Burns. I have regularly listened to the podcast for a few months now, and I cannot recommend it enough. Thank you for being with us today, Mr. Townsend. So I'm gonna leave the floor now for our speakers, and I invite Dr. Kimball to begin if she would like to.
Hello all. Merci beaucoup pour l'introduction très gentille, Vincent. So my viewpoint essentially on NATO and on the elections is fundamentally informed by the research that I've been doing on particularly understanding the institutional and delegation aspects of the treaty itself, thinking about the legal aspects, but also thinking about how and understanding how NATO itself has adapted as an institution over time, particular to the new context. So we see in NATO an institution that has successfully adapted to the Cold War, again, kind of looked inside itself for a search for meaning after 9/11, and again did a type of transformation, but all without touching the treaty itself, which makes NATO special in some senses when we look at international institutions. Most of the other institutions, we see there are adaptations to mandate or small changes on the edges, just like, for instance, the European Union. But NATO itself remains this kind of solid structure because of its flexibility. And so one of the things that which is interesting to consider is, of course, I would highlight in the current circumstance under the current president of the United States, we have seen some signs of what we might say malaise in the organization. But what we don't understand is if these are kind of internal structural foundational difficulties, or if these are kind of fleeting stochastic things because of President Trump in office, kind of changing the disequilibrium. What we can say in the current context is that there are some signs of discomfort going on in the institution. Observing what is going on right now with Greece and Turkey. France seems to be dipping in a little bit as well. In that context, we also have seen just this weekend the conflict in Armenia has become unfrozen again a little bit. And so to what extent there is an eye from NATO on that. And then finally, I would suggest that there is kind of foundational concerns about the coherence of the institution in the follow-up of Brexit that we have seen. There are some kind of policy externalities coming out in terms of, and I would expect in the future, burden sharing to become even more debatable, as particularly as France and Germany would want to shift some of the burden more towards the UK as they're carrying more burden in the EU right now. And so that is also going to have an effect. And finally, of course, President Trump is the first president in history that is, kind of put a question mark towards the US commitment. No other president in American history has said some of the things that he has said to states, in private conversations, he said to countries more or less, if you're not making your 2%, why would you think NATO would come and protect you? He's acting as if NATO defense is a quid pro quo for states, and this is very uncomfortable for some states. And then combine that with the signals that he's sending with the delicate withdrawal of troops from Germany. I think that we're at a moment right now where, NATO is very much facing forward as an institution that has, a role and a reputation, and we see its solidness. But when you're opening up the door behind, you can see some of these things going on. And so elections give us a nice opportunity to reflect upon what's really going to happen in the next 4 years.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kimball, for this very, very insightful presentation. I will now turn to Dr. Bricker, who will discuss, among other things, public opinion and NATO.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the NATO Association for inviting me today, and to be a part of such a distinguished panel is a real opportunity. So I thank you very much for bringing this group together for this conversation. It might not surprise you, I guess, that I would come at this from the perspective of a pollster, given that's what I do for a living. And what we're looking at right now is what we would consider to be the Mount Everest of political polling problems to solve, and that's trying to understand the dynamics of the US election campaign. Here's what we know so far. Despite the big lead in the national polls that the Democrats have and Joe Biden has, the battleground polls in the battleground states, I should say, are close and they're tightening. Not just in the presidential race, but also in a key series of Senate races. The House is already a foregone conclusion. We know that it's going to go Democrat. As much as the president has a role to play in setting foreign policy for the United States, we also know that the Senate plays a really important role as well. So what's going to happen there is going to have major implications for what happens to all sorts of foreign interactions by the United States. The campaign dynamics, people will get very sophisticated about what I would consider to be fairly minor events in the course of a campaign. what we've been able to discern from the polls is that there's really only two things that matter right now. And that's the COVID crisis, the pandemic, and the economy. If this election campaign on voting day, and by the way, people are already starting to vote, but if this election campaign is really about the COVID crisis, the advantage for Joe Biden is strong. If this election campaign is about the economy, the advantage for President Trump is pretty strong. So really what the next 4 weeks is going to be about is sorting through what Americans are voting about. If they're voting on the management of the pandemic, we're likely to have a Democratic president and probably a more Democratic Senate. If this is really about economic confidence and creating jobs, then we're likely to end up with President Trump being in a position where he might be reelected, and the Senate doing better for the Republicans than maybe current polls suggest. Most other issues, including the issues, the fight over, for example, equity and racism, even the tax returns that were released by the New York Times, the replacement of the Supreme Court justice, these all actually work to the advantage, believe it or not, of Mr. Trump. And the reason is because if we're talking about that, we're not talking about the COVID crisis. And we know that's his biggest vulnerability. As far as NATO is concerned and foreign policy is concerned, it's playing very little role in the election campaign right now, which is very hyper-focused on domestic issues. We do a poll on a regular basis. We've tracked NATO for at least the last 10 years, and opinions worldwide about NATO have not changed. Opinions in most member states have not changed. Opinions even in the United States of NATO, even during the course of President Trump's tenure, have not changed. It ranks just below the United Nations in terms of people's level of respect. Even in the, as I said before, even in the United States, the majority population support for NATO. Whether people have an informed opinion about that is another question, another discussion. But in terms of just the brand and its level of public awareness, NATO continues to do well in spite of what's happened with, I would say, elite decision making in the United States and presidential decision making. Opinions about NATO haven't changed really in the US, and they really haven't changed in any of the member states. You can see there are fluctuations. For example, support for NATO has gone down a bit in Poland, probably due as a result to some domestic circumstances. We've seen some fluctuations in other places, but what tends to happen is it tends to be driven by specific events in the news and has a base level rate that allows it to bounce back up when those issues become less pertinent. If Trump wins, I expect to see very much the same type of foreign policy approach as we've seen over the last little while. If Biden wins the campaign, and particularly if he gets a Democratic Senate, I expect to see more international engagement and a desire to move away from the positioning of President Trump. Will that have a big impact on NATO's reputation in the United States, given that we haven't seen much impact as a result of what President Trump was doing? We didn't see it previously in terms of President Obama and what he was doing with NATO. I don't expect that we're going to be seeing very much unless there's a really serious focused issue in the news that gets people's attention and really focuses on the purpose of NATO. So what are we expected to see in terms of foreign policy dominating in the United States over the next while? I think we'll continue to see more of what we've seen over the last 4 years, which is a fundamental preoccupation with China and its role not only as a military threat, but also as an economic threat and a trade threat. Francis Fukuyama said that history ended back in with the fall of the Berlin Wall because there was no more hegemon to challenge the United States. There now is a hegemon. And one of the things that we found in the poll that we did last year for the Halifax International Security Forum was that China has actually become an aspirational hegemon for some particularly less empowered countries, less developed countries. And that's not something that we've seen in a very long time, where there's been a country that's been able to expand its presence beyond its own border in terms of aspiration. for other countries. So it will be really interesting to see how that transposes over the last while. I will tell you in our latest polling that China's reputation has taken a very dramatic hit on the same level as the election of President Trump in terms of its international reputation. And this was back in 2016 when President Trump was elected. China's taken a similar significant dip as a result of what's happened with COVID. So very interesting times. When you invite the public into this conversation and we get past the usual, I guess, people who are experts on NATO and public policy talking about these, or foreign policy talking about these things, you tend to find that there's less, I would say, urgency in the conversation of the public, and their focus tends not to be on organizations like NATO at the moment, and they are really much more focused, particularly in the United States during this election period, on China if they have any foreign policy concerns at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bricker, for his very interesting presentation. Mr. Townsend, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here with you all, and I want to first thank Robert and Chloe for putting this thing on, and to the Canadian Atlantic Treaty Association chapter, which is really leading within all of the among all the chapters and within the ATA, and that's a wonderful thing. And I really appreciate all the great support, Robert, that you have given me over time, and thank you. It's a great honor to be here. I think I agree with everything that the panelists have said so far, with very interesting words from you all, which I really appreciate. We need more of the Canadian perspective down here in Washington, and I really learned from you all, and I really appreciate that. I'm going to make just a couple quick points because I know we want to go to questions. The first is in talking about, so what would it look like if Biden were to win? I think there are some very obvious things that you would see, and this should come as no surprise. I think there'll be a tone change, that's for sure. I don't think you're going to see the kind of disruptive and rude remarks, if I can get a little political here, that you heard from Trump on a consistent basis. I think probably in the inaugural address, should Biden win, he would talk about the U.S. commitment to NATO, making sure that everyone understood that there will not be a book written over the next 4 years where one of his staffers would say that they had to talk him out of leaving NATO, the way the John Bolton book totally was riveting as he was describing talking Trump out of leaving the alliance. And I think you're going to see something else too, and that's a stronger feel of U.S. leadership at NATO. I know in saying that in this day, people probably would roll up in a ball and say, my God, we don't need U.S. leadership. This sounds like it could go in a horrible direction. But I think what I have seen, certainly when I was at NATO, is that U.S. leadership can make a difference, particularly if it's heading in a direction that can bring the alliance along. I have been there during the George W. Bush days when we came to the table at NATO with perspectives out of Washington that were not agreed, and that kind of U.S. leadership was pretty turbulent. But I think with a Joe Biden administration, the leadership is going to be something that everyone can recognize, and it'll be something that will hopefully take the adaptation that we're going through now. That some of the panelists have talked about. NATO is always going through adaptation, but we're going through a big one right now, and I think U.S. leadership at this moment at NATO could be helpful, and I think you will see that. But I think we need to know too that problems are going to remain, and so I think we're going to have to work on those together. One of them is burden sharing that was already discussed, and it's not just hammering nations over the head about meeting their 2%, it's really getting and digging down into what does burden sharing really mean and trying to widen the aperture when we talk about what does it mean and what are the expectations of allies that we have of each other. What, as we bear burdens together, what does that look like? How can we do a better job of having nations bear more of the burden? It's more than just spending money. That was a political mark on the wall. I remember when we did this, we've always had trouble with this. There's not exactly an algorithm that gave us the 2%. So I think from all that I've talked to, all the people in the campaign, I think that's going to be on the agenda. The second thing and most important thing, and it goes to what Anessa was talking about in terms of her work. She was talking about the NATO treaty and the legal aspects of it, and one of the things that we're going to have to do is have a new strategic concept. which is why we don't have to go amend the North Atlantic Treaty, which would just be horrible. No one wants to do that, and we don't need to. It's written in a beautiful way. The strategic concept takes that treaty and says, and operationalizes and says, what do we want to do now? What do allies want to do now? And we have held off from doing that for a number of years for various reasons. If Joe Biden is elected, I think what's one of the first things we will suggest to the alliance that let's begin to put one together. That's a heavy lift, I will tell you. But it's something that I think we need to do because there's a relevance issue. And this gets to, again, what the panelists have talked about in terms of NATO and the challenge that we have, which is to keep it as solid as it is, and as solid as the North Atlantic Treaty is. What's not solid is how we are looked upon in terms of our relevance among a young generation of transatlanticists who are coming up, many who are listening here. How can we make sure that NATO is not so solid and set in its ways that it becomes irrelevant? The strategic concept will help us focus on that. And some of the things I think we're going to have to deal with, and frankly, the SecGen is already talking about this, is climate, a better definition of what do we do together about China. China is not Russia in terms of the threat that it poses to the alliance. So what does this mean? How can we better go about doing that with allies, all of us together? How do you deal with Russia, which is the more traditional problem that we've got? But what do we do about arms control? Arms control is a very important part of of national security, and we've lost our way there, quite frankly. So if Joe Biden were to be elected, I think you're going to find a renewed emphasis on these things. I think you'll see U.S. leadership here, and it won't be leadership where it's either our way or the highway. It's going to be something that we're going to do together. We will be doing it in Ottawa as much as we're going to be doing in Washington and in other capitals too. And so I think you will see that. One point I want to make, and I think maybe I should end it here because I've talked too much, is that we all, I think, will acknowledge that certainly since 1990, when the Cold War ended, the U.S. has been trying to figure out its relationship to Europe. Our relationship to Canada is a well-known and is a good one and a solid one, and one that got some battering over the past 4 years that really upset all of us. And we will, as far as Canada is concerned, we will be back, and we'll be back as good friends, and we can work on whatever issues we may have, but as cousins, as good friends. But I think in terms of Europe, we're still trying to figure out what is our relationship with Europe now. I can tell you because I've worked Europe since that time, and every administration that's come along has wrestled with that. And many administrations start off with not a very good or a benign view of Europe, and by the time 4 years has gone by or 8 years, they're stronger with Europe. But we have to get them there because once the Cold War ended, this idea of the U.S. as a European power, what does that really mean? So we will still have that issue. Because in a Biden administration, if it comes in, is what makes sense in this day and age. And just a couple points, and then I'll close off. Number one is, where is Europe in our priority? I will tell you, during the Obama days, it wasn't the top priority. Other things were. It wasn't a negative view about Europe, but it was just a benign neglect until the Russians invaded Crimea, and then things changed. Also, Europe has changed over the past 4 years. Europe has been having its own, trying to find itself as well. I'm sure Canada has wrestled with that with the Europeans too. U.S. and Canada share many frustrations, I think, in dealing with the European Union or dealing with Europe. And so I think we've got to figure out what kind of Europe do we have now, because Europe has looked at the United States and said, why should we throw our lot in with you guys? You're walking away from NATO. You're walking away from engagement in Europe. We don't feel we share values with you anymore from what we're hearing. And it's also fed within Europe this feeling of we need to stand on our own feet. We need not to be dependent on the United States. We've got to chart our own way. You hear that out of Paris and other places, and they're not wrong. We want a strong Europe. We want a Europe that can stand on its own feet. We don't want to have a Europe that we're competing with, or that for the United States we're jealous of, like, hey, we're in charge, not you guys. That was a problem back in the 90s. So we've got to figure that out. And I think Europe wants to figure that out too. Strategic autonomy, I think, I know where their heart is in that, But I think strategic responsibility is probably a better terminology for a Europe that feels it's got to take on more of the burden, the more of the responsibility with dealing with problems that we share, like China. We will never deal with China or an epidemic unless we do it together as partners and not as a hegemon coming in and saying, hey, get out of the way. Either we're going to do it or we're going to make you do it. And it's not that. We've got to do it together. I think under Joe Biden, it'll be much more like that. I know the people who are working on his policies, and that's where the thinking is. But it will be a different Europe that Joe Biden will visit than he visited a few years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Townsend. Thank you to all of you for great, interesting presentations and for respecting the allotted time so that we can ask questions. We can discuss between us and then take the questions from the audience. For the audience, I invite you to start sending your questions either through YouTube or through the Q&A function that is located down right on your Zoom screen. So if I may, I would like to ask the first question. Two of you noted the importance of the rise of China for the future of NATO. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg in June said that we need to acknowledge the rise of China. We need to find ways to deal with its consequences without necessarily considering China as a rival, as an enemy, as an adversary. So I want to ask you, the three of you, how could NATO address the rise of China without taking an adversarial stance?
Well, I'll take a swing at that. I think it's a great question, and I don't think there's an answer to it yet. I think it's really an interesting point because if you talk to the allies, everyone has a different cut at it. Everyone has a different view. Italy is different. They're part of Belt and Road. The United States certainly today has a very different view of that. And everything in between. I'm not sure where Ottawa is, but there's only two allies that have a Pacific face, and it's the U.S. and Canada. So we have a very special look at China that the European allies don't have. But I think the way I try to think about a NATO role is that NATO needs to help allies individually deal with China. China is a huge trading partner, both for us here and for you and for Europe. It's not like we can just turn off the spigots. But like 5G, I think has really been an issue that has taught a lot of us about the issue. Some people need that equipment coming out of China. Others are having trouble with needing it on the one hand, but also recognizing the implications for that, the potential Chinese engagement in that. And so there's a need to find an honest broker somewhere on the security and defense side, particularly, that can come in and advise allies on what does it mean in terms of 5G and what are the alternatives and what are the risks and what are the benefits of dealing with China. And I think that's one thing that NATO can do. They can sit down with allies and who want it, sit down with allies and go through where the problems are based on intelligence and based on probably a common sight picture maybe that the allies can have on various issues. I don't think we're going to see a time where we're going to have complete consensus at NATO on China, but I think there is consensus on a NATO role working with the European Union, quite frankly, where we can help advise allies on how do you deal with things such as 5G. So that's one example.
Okay, thank you.
I would suggest that one of the issues, so I did a study on basically the types of disputes and the conflicts that China and Russia have had over the last 15 years. So one of my questions was basically this question of what is rise versus decline? What are they fighting? What are the disputes about? Where are these disputes taking place? Are they regional? Are they global? Right? And so this was basically to try to get at this question of understanding exactly what we're fighting about and how China and Russia are basically reivindicating the status quo. And so one of the things that this study showed is that Russia tends to really see its activities appear to be more as a declining regional hegemon, whereas China appears to be broadening its sphere of activities. China has not yet used violence in one of these kind of disputes over the status quo. We did see, obviously, Russia use violence when it went into Crimea and Georgia and other places, right? And so I think it's important to understand this context. We're putting them together, but they're not at all the same type of threat, strategic threat. I think one of the things we also often forget when we talk about Asia and China particularly is that NATO should be playing a strong role in supporting regional partners like Japan and Australia and South Korea. We don't talk about that much because they're not NATO members, but in a very real sense, that they are our strategic linchpins in the region. And we should care because right now, the U.S. has the lowest number of troops it's ever had in South Korea since the end of the Korean War. I mean, if there is a sign of U.S. Slow disengagement from the region, it is those types of behaviors. And so I think in some senses, because NATO might disagree amongst itself what to do, it might rather focus on those in what we would say the limited region around China and figure out how they can support these countries. And I think one of the things that we've seen is that Australia has taken a look at this probably the most strategically and critically of all of those states. The new white paper from Australia takes seriously the idea that the benevolent hegemon might not actually come and save us. And I think Canada, among many other allies, has not seriously taken this reflection. The idea that a large part of Canadian, territorial sovereignty and internal security relies on this belief of, we might say the older brother coming and securing Canada. I tried to tell my students, if you think that there's a ballistic missile that's coming over the Arctic and the US is going to wait to hit it until it gets over American territory, you don't understand how geography works. The US will be simply shooting the missile out of the sky over the Canadian territory. And so Canada, in some senses, Canadians particularly, don't have this geostrategic reflection on the world because they have kind of a built-in security because of the Arctic, because of close relations with the US, because on the other side you have large, coasts. And so I think that in some senses, the strategic aspect of considering geography, place, location, Canada has not necessarily focused on that the way that other countries have, like Australia. And we see it reflected in their strategic thinking. And so I hope if Canada decides to do another national defense review, as has been rumors kind of circulating around, that I hope that there will be kind of a larger reflection on, Canada wants to be a multilateralist, but what is Canadian multilateralism absent the United States? What is Canadian multilateralism absent strong British or French or German support? And I think that right now there's not very many deep reflections going on about that. And that really is how Canada needs to think about its place in the world as a leader, if it wants to be a leader.
Thank you, Dr. Bricker.
Oh, I was going to say what Dr. Kimball said. I'll just go check. That was very good. And I'll just come at this from a bit of a different angle. I hope it's a different angle. To me, foreign policy is really a reflection of domestic political forces and realities, especially in democracies. Populism and nationalism in the world today is the prevalent political force. It continues unabated. It's driven, particularly on foreign policy issues, by a misalignment between what our prime minister called the anywheres and the somewheres. Our previous prime minister called it, this idea that there's this foreign policy elite that thinks about these issues at a much higher level and they've evolved themselves into thinking beyond those domestic political realities without understanding that ultimately where they have to go back to are those domestic political realities and find a way to be able to be, I would say, acceptable within that context. We've seemed to have lost that level of connection over the years. And understanding the specific political interests that need to be aligned with that. I mean, the United States, there's always been this, and in Canada too, we call them the Laurentian elite. John Ibbotson and I wrote about them in The Big Shift, which is this group of middle fixers, whether they're wearing blue or whether they're wearing red. They basically agree on most things in the world. And to the extent that we had differences in foreign policy, it was really whether you use salt or pepper on your meat. I mean, it didn't really matter that much. Everybody kind of agreed. And it's been like that, I would say, for most of the democracies over the space of the period between the end of the Cold War and today. What's happened is domestic political forces have reasserted themselves, and they have a very different view of these things than the people who are in the foreign policy elite. And there's no better example that you can look at than China. So people in the foreign policy elite see this as a political actor, a foreign policy actor that we need to find a way forward with. The domestic opinion of it is extreme skepticism, which has grown even more skeptical as a result of the pandemic, and a real feeling that what's happened because of free trade, particularly with China, that we have damaged particularly our manufacturing economies, that we've come out on the bad end of all of this. And by the way, this isn't just an American point of view, this is also a Canadian point of view. So Trump and actors like Trump didn't create what's going on right now in foreign policy. He just found the fumes and lit the flame. He threw the match and it blew up. And our foreign policy elites and experts have struggled to try and understand this. And the way that they try to understand this is actually in terms of economic forces and some of these geopolitical forces. Why? Because they're variables they understand. The solutions are things that most people of I guess, a reasonable education level and a reasonable experience with these issues could align themselves on. You know, are we going to have slightly freer trade or slightly less free trade? Or are taxes going to be slightly higher or slightly lower? Are we going to attend this meeting or we're not going to attend this meeting? Are we going to participate in this peacekeeping mission or are we not going to participate in this peacekeeping mission? The public isn't talking about that. The public's really talking about existential crisis in terms of inequality. They're talking about the fact that their voices aren't heard in an awful lot of the conversation that takes place over everything from domestic trade policy through to foreign policy in military issues. So one of the, I think, the big challenges for people who are on the other side of this, and even if Joe Biden gets elected, I mean, it's wonderful that he's going to go have a different tone at international meetings, and heaven knows we could all use that. The world could use that today. But the truth is, that's not especially well connected with what American public opinion is these days, who have a real serious difficulty with China and the damage that was done as a result of free trade, in their view, correctly or incorrectly, over the space of the period of the last 2 decades under both Republican and Democratic administrations. And they want somebody who's prepared to speak to that, which is how Donald Trump is able to do what he's able to do. He's able to speak to that cultural seam in American politics and really connect with it and build a winning coalition out of it. And Donald Trump is just one example of this. That seam continues to exist. It continues to grow. The conflict continues to grow. And for everybody who thinks that this is specifically an American problem, you are wrong. It exists in most democracies in the world today. Populism, particularly nationalist populism, is the predominant force in most politics. I just have to look at Brazil. I have to look at Mexico. I even have to look at France, where Macron is under a certain amount of pressure. Look at the government in Italy these days. It's happening all over the world, and our elites who are supposed to talk about these things are lost in these conversations that are very, very rational and not connected with what's happening in the lives of everyday people. And I apologize for being passionate about this, but I see the numbers. I look at it every day, and I hear these conversations about these issues, and I ask myself, who's talking about this anywhere right now? They're just not. They're talking about their view of tomorrow is not a decade. Their view of tomorrow is Wednesday. We don't know if we can go to work. I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr. Kimball.
I would add two small things to that.
Monologue right now, sorry.
One thing is that in the American public, there is a very tacit acceptance that a Biden policy would be a bit of a continuation of an Obama policy, right? So we would be mostly retaking back up, perhaps, where Obama left off with some small changes. And so the American public is in their mind, right, comparing what they believe a future Biden foreign policy would be with a Bayesian update of what was Obama's foreign policy, right? And then they're comparing this to what they know from what they've seen of Trump. And the issue is that the populist support that that Trump can mobilize are exactly the people that are essentially less educated, that for them, this is simply job dislocation and job loss, right? The economic liberal capitalist story, right? This is the long effects of liberalism. Liberalism and openness literally means jobs become dislocated because they go to places where it is cheaper for labor, right? And so we explain this away by saying that democratic countries should then kind of create jobs and do all sorts of things so that these people that lose jobs can be retrained. This is the ideal explanation of what this looks like. But in the reality, the retraining and all of that, that's not what's happening with the people that lost the jobs, right? We are not rehiring and retraining a guy, somebody who's working in an automobile factory, right? We are retraining people to work in healthcare or to work in, telecommunications. So in a market sense, these things are balancing, but from an individual pocketbook sense, that guy who lost his job, he's listening to Trump. And I think that that's also part of the problem of the elites not connecting the message to the people.
And this is part of it, but it sort of misses it just a little. And I don't mean that in a bad way, because it's where we default, as again, as I said, it's to these economic things, the things that we can understand. Actually, a big part of this is cultural.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
a really big part of it is cultural.
Establishment, right? Trump positions himself as being outside of the establishment. He is going to work very hard to position Biden as being inside the game of Washington, a Washington insider, going to kind of continue all of this. And remember, that was exactly the cleavage that he won on Hillary against, right? I'm not in the establishment, and so I'm not in this evil machine of Washington. And he can still mobilize this discourse because basically he's been, fighting with Congress.
Mr. Townsend, do you want to jump in?
But another part of this is I should just put it on the table, and then is immigration is a really, really big part of this.
Of course.
And that's the cultural element. Anyway, sorry, Jim, I cut you off.
No, this is great. And I don't disagree at all with you all, but just to throw a little bit of a nuance in. So when it comes to the American public that I've seen, there's a split between this frustration and anger, the rise in populism coming as a result of trade, which I think you're absolutely right. It's all over. It's a feature of this globalization, as we've read and heard for many years. It's a feature of that. But when it comes to NATO, and Darrell, your numbers exactly point to this. When it comes to NATO or comes to the Pentagon or to the U.S. military here in the U.S., you don't get that. If I talk to a Trumper, I mean, my family, I came out of the South. And when I would go home from Washington, I would be greeted with great skepticism until I said, well, I work in the Pentagon. And they, so have a seat. We'll buy you a beer. And it's like, and so when it comes to that, or even NATO, when I tell people, well, I do NATO and this type of thing, they're all, very much in favor of that because they just mash it all together. The military, the Pentagon, NATO, it's all our guys in uniform. And it's like, okay, I'll let you go there with that. But then when you talk about these other things, as you get into start edging into foreign policy, and that gets into trade and this type of thing, exactly what you all are saying pops out, and we have to deal with that. And I don't think Biden has spoken so much about that. The domestic situation in the U.S. is so turbulent now, particularly after the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I mean, it's just. I know y'all are just across the border, but if you were right here, you wake up in the morning and you just wonder what's happened. And so that has pushed off any hope of discussion. But I was saying before we went on the air that NATO has come up when in talking about how irrational or how dangerous, if you will, Trump is. because as something to hit him over the head with, because of this support for NATO, because of this support in the U.S. for the military, for the Pentagon, and this type of thing. Saying, well, he wants to pull us out of NATO, even a Trumper is that they don't know what to make of that, because that's not something that drives them at all. So, and just finally, Dr. Kimball, what you were saying about will we just see as many, because Biden himself hasn't talked that much about a Biden foreign policy, there is an assumption in the U.S. That's, well, I guess we have to kind of triangulate a little bit and say, well, we're going to get a little bit of Obama, and we're going to get and I guess my point is, and among a lot of his advisors is, that's great for people to assume that, but that had better not be the case, because we're going to have a very young generation come in. The young generation doesn't agree with the blob. We call ourselves in Washington, people like me are part of the blob, the elite that does foreign and defense policy. The blob has got to understand that our time is up. And there is a new sheriff coming in town. It's not Biden, but it's progressives, and it's a younger generation in Europe and in the US that don't see things quite the way that we would have 20 years ago. Not that they want to do away with the institutions that we've all built since World War II, but it's like, we just don't feel it has to be this way. We think there's got to be another approach. And so what I'm hoping that we're going to actually see, if Biden comes in, is a little bit of the old, not necessarily Obama. It'll be a Biden, because even within the Obama administration, Biden had different views. But what I'm hoping we're going to see is something that is the beginning of a trajectory in U.S. foreign and defense policy. That's not something that is just warmed over whatever we would have done 20 years ago. I'm hoping that's what we're gonna see.
I want to ask one last question, and please keep your answers short before we open to the audience. We just talked a lot about what would happen if Joe Biden wins the election. What happens if Donald Trump is reelected president for NATO? And more specifically, Dr. Kimball, you talked a lot about the adaptability, the flexibility, and the resiliency of an institution like NATO. Would the institutional mechanisms that allow for this flexibility and adaptability hold during 4 more years of Donald Trump? And what would happen if Donald Trump declares that he's pulling out the US from NATO?
I think fundamentally it relies on a couple of things. When we're trying to explain, Trump's foreign policy behavior, there's various theoretical arguments that run from, Dan Drezner's, he's a toddler in chief, so we should examine him as if we would think about a 4 or 5-year-old that's been upset, to, Wolf's kind of transactional argument about Trump. And so for him, it's all about kind of the accounting. And so he's on a big conquest. I joke in class, like if he found an outstanding debt from the Marshall Plan, he would probably try to collect on it, right? And so I think that, and then there's, other arguments that suggest that he's just extremely, obsessed with his reputation. And so, in some senses, it will depend on very much how Trump feels NATO has treated him, right? If he thinks that NATO has disrespected him or, alienated him, he's ready to come back with the fight. He's not afraid to bring it to NATO. So I think that's one thing that we need to, be focused on a little bit, is that he, takes everything kind of extremely personally. He withdraws from agreements. I think the handshake that didn't happen around the world was the handshake with Angela Merkel when he refused to shake her hand after their private discussions. The critical feminist in me, I show that in my class all the time, because that is like, it is, gender politics 101. And so again, I think that for Trump, at least, he's taking it, what can NATO do? I think NATO can just try to stay out of his line of fire.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That was really interesting. And I guess that the fact that some heads of state, not to name them, have left behind his back at the last NATO summit didn't help in terms of disrespect or felt disrespect. Chloe, can we please open the floor for questions? Will you ask them or?
Yes, I can ask them.
Okay, thank you.
Our first question is about NATO's role or reaction to this election. Donald Trump recently declared that he won't commit to accepting the outcome of the election if he loses. Considering NATO's commitment to democratic values, how would the alliance react in this scenario? And overall, what could or should NATO do in the event of a contested election in the United States?
Great question. Anyone?
Well, I would definitely recommend staying out of it. And I think, NATO is practiced in staying out of the internal affairs of allies, and also urging allies, don't bring your problems to NATO and put it on our table here. And sometimes we're successful in that and sometimes not. But I think in terms of the United States, I'm sure allies and the SecGen and others are just going to hope that we can quickly get through this and get back into a traditional inauguration, and then the first 100 days, and not get drawn. I don't think they'll be drawn into it, and they don't want to put their toe in the water.
Yeah, I would say that there's two interesting questions on this one, and it's the gap of the victory, one way or the other. There's going to be exit polling. There's going to be all sorts of information about what actually happened in the election campaign, other than just the counting of the votes, which, by the way, could take a protracted period of time. So we'll get some sense of what the American people, what it was on election night. And if Joe Biden, if the pollsters make a mistake this time, it's probably in that direction rather than in the Republican direction, because it's interesting we're talking about NATO here, because pollsters, just like generals, always refight the last war. So everybody's trying to protect against underestimating what the Trump vote is, and the outcome could potentially be that we're underestimating what the Biden vote might be. So depends on what happens on election day, and then after that through to the inauguration. And we're talking about potentially a very specific period of time that could be very intense. Would NATO play a role in that? I don't think so. But the other part of this is not just what happens in the office of the president, but what happens in the Senate. So if a whole bunch of red senators flip blue this time around, and all of a sudden the Democrats have a majority in the Senate, that probably creates a different kind of dynamic in terms of the leadership in the United States. So it's going to be a very interesting period of time, and over between now and inauguration day in early January, in which a lot of this has to be worked out. I think NATO and everybody else in the world will just be standing back and watching in awe.
I would say also, in the past, of course, NATO has definitely, we would say, deprioritized democracy in favor of ensuring security and defense. Poland, Hungary, NATO has issued some kind of very broad statements about democratic issues there, events and stuff like that. I would not think NATO would have the unity to release any sort of statement at all on electoral happenings or issues in the US, especially because Trump would be insulted, more or less, by NATO thinking it has a role to say in domestic politics. I would also note that when it comes to Jim mentioned that we're up here in Canada watching this. Actually, I am American, so I'm up here watching this, all sitting in American skin, and kind of watching it all kind of fall apart. And I've already sent in my ballot, and with the mail-in ballots, as Darrell said, this will probably be a longer count. We probably remember the hanging chads from 2000. I don't think we're going to be in that state. But I think that if we have any results at all, I don't think it's going to be maybe on the night of November 3rd. I think that, some things will be drawn out. And I anticipate that, especially in some of the swing states where they're doing a lot of absentee voting right now. And of course, I would have never had the NBA on my bingo card for supporting voter turnout by having voting centers in NBA, And so I think that's also one of the things that is interesting, is that at least the election is so competitive. We are seeing new entrepreneurial voting actors come into the screen. And so I think that's great. More participation is better for democracy. That's the bottom line.
Do we have the time for one last question, or yes? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Baines. Chloe, you can go ahead.
Yeah, so our next questions are about the current state of the relationship between the United States and NATO. Trump has been certainly more vocal about criticizing the European allies for not doing their part to meet the 2% NATO defense spending target. But Obama also caught criticism for being too disengaged from European security. Is repairing and fixing the United States relationships with their allies a priority for Joe Biden? And what does the Biden administration, if he's elected, needs to do to rebuild American trust in NATO?
I'll take a swing at that as well. First, I think what does the Biden team need to do to repair relations with NATO and with Europe, and is that a priority? I'll say yes, it's a priority, and I think he has said that it's a priority. But I know from personal experience with him that the Munich Security Conference, usually in February every year, is a big gathering for all of the transatlantic tribes, and he always goes. In fact, I was there with him a couple of years ago when he pulled a small group of us together and said, I think I'm going to run. We've got to get our relations with Europe back on track and stuff. So I've seen him talk about that right up front. And so I know it's a priority, and I know there's a lot of thinking going on about how to do that in a smart way. Again, it can't just be cookie cutter from what Obama did or anyone else. It's things have changed, and we've got to live up with that. I don't think that there is a lack of trust in NATO among the American people. I think certainly there is, and I'm sure Darrell has got numbers on this. I think there certainly is a slice of the American public that is xenophobic, or when it comes to foreign policy or working with allies, they feel we're being ripped off, and that's what Trump has tried to mine, is that feeling that we're being abused and taken advantage of. I've run into people who say that too. But I think on the whole, there is support for NATO. I think the numbers are there that show that. And I think really it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is we in the US have got to do a better job of explaining not just NATO, and not just to build up even more trust than there is already. We've got to somehow, and it's our education system, there's a lot of reasons for it. We've got to have a better understanding of foreign policy and the US role in the world and this type of thing. And trade, I mean, there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of ignorance out there. And I think it's not just in the US, it's within the number of allied countries it's like that. But we in the US have got to do a better job of explaining that, so that so that those who do have problems with NATO or do have problems with the US in the international community, that they have a better understanding of why we do that, and that we can brush past the misunderstandings that causes xenophobia. There'll always be that element, but I think we have got to put it as best we can in the box and not let it feed and become something that Trump can actually can take advantage of.
Can I just add something to that? If I was asked on this question, I guess I have been asked. One of the things that is always difficult for anybody who gets elected into office, and I'm sure I know, Jim, you've talked to political leaders. I've certainly dealt with a lot of them over the years, and I'm sure Dr. Kimball has too. We get easily confused by missions or by messages and mandates. And what's going to happen as a result of what goes on in this election, if Joe Biden gets elected, is really a message more than it is a specific mandate. And by that, I mean it's going to be a rejection of what Donald Trump has been doing, and a very strong referendum about his leadership, particularly on how he managed the coronavirus, and people want him out. There's going to be a very well developed, as there always is, group of people with a lot of policy ideas around Joe Biden who are going to read their agenda into what just happened. By the way, we're seeing the same thing on the pandemic right now. People who were saying the same thing before now see the pandemic as the absolute best opportunity to create the once in a generation greatest thing of all time, and now's my chance. Not so much. That's not where the public is today. The public, as we go through what's going to happen in the United States, public emotion is very raw, just as I think Jim has absolutely described, and I believe Anessa has done a good job as an expat describing too. So he's got to be very careful about what the message was that was sent and the limited size of the mandate he has to change, and really understanding what it is specifically that people want to change relative to our foreign policy positions. It's not just, hey, we're going back, let's forget it. It was, a nightmare period. We're just going to all just move on. The things that elected Donald Trump previously are still there, and a smart Joe Biden would figure that out and try to find a way to reflect it in American foreign policy, specifically with NATO. But along with that, understanding that Donald Trump's presidency hasn't done irreparable damage, just as Jim has quite correctly stated, for NATO's reputation in the United States. The polling on this is very clear. It hasn't really moved. But also, it's the same with NATO's reputation in all the countries in NATO. It hasn't really been affected that much by what's been going on with Donald Trump in the United States. The goodwill is on the other side too. So the political leaders, if they're astute on the other sides of this in other countries in NATO, will also understand the agenda of their own publics. As I said before, foreign policy is really a reflection of sort of domestic priorities in terms of public opinion. And understanding that would be a good thing, but it's smart for Joe Biden to understand that too, that there's a reservoir of goodwill that continues in the in NATO, but also in the United States that's likely to rise as a result of Donald Trump's departure. So there's an awful good opportunity to start rebuilding at an incremental level the relationship between the United States and the rest of the NATO partners, but don't feel like we can just sweep aside what's happened over the last 4 years and not see that as a legitimate reflection of how divided American public opinion is on some of these questions.
I'll take the last moment to slightly disagree with both of my esteemed colleagues. Having lived in Canada from the transition to Bush Jr. to Obama was extremely illuminating. We might say that as George Bush Jr. left office, relations between Canada and the United States were extremely difficult, especially with not going into Iraq. Anti-Americanism at that period was pretty much at an all-time high in Canada. Even in my classes, there was, signs of anti-Americanism. We all know Quebec is a little different anyways. And so it was almost as though turning on the light when Obama took office. It was not as though everything was forgiven, but it was this moment of kind of like deep respiration and calm in Ottawa, where there was this idea that here is somebody that we can intellectually engage in. Here is somebody that is open to seeing things our way, right? And I think that despite everything on the ground that has happened for Trump, there is a large, like you said, there is a large reservoir of being willing to be open, especially because Canada right now has a liberal government. I think, for instance, it will be easier to kind of heal relations with governments that are liberal than probably with governments that are, more conservative, kind of ideologically seeing on the same page. And so, yeah, I expect it to be bumpy, but I don't expect it to be as difficult. But also because Biden has, he's got foreign policy historical credibility, right? He was on the terrain some. He's, even though we don't know exactly what he's going to bring, people know what he's about, right? He has a bit of a trademark when it comes to foreign policy. And so that alone, I think, will bring a certain level of calm and almost a reset to the game. So, yeah, we're going to have to go back and we'll have to talk about certain files that are going to be very difficult, like immigration is going to be a file that's going to continue, for example, to have difficulty in NATO and cross-border relations and stuff like that. But I think, for instance, when it comes to the nuts and bolts of defense, simply Biden going into office will very much calm a lot of these stakeholders in defense and in security. And so again, I think that even though I don't expect it to be a perfect transition, but I don't think it's going to be as difficult or acrimonious as we might think. I just think that we have 4 years of Trump. And so we have now become conditioned to kind of perceive US presidents now how everybody else perceives Trump. And that was very much what it was in Canada with the Bush-Obama transition. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that I'm probably a little more optimistic, but that's probably also part of now living in Canada.
We have a lot to think about now, at least until November 3rd. As Dr. Bricker noted, maybe for the next few days, for the next few weeks after November 3rd, since there might be uncertainty about the result of the elections. And we have a lot to think in terms of what is going to happen in the next 4 years. I want to thank every one of you for participating today, Dr. Kimball, Dr. Bricker, Mr. Townsend, thank you very much. I want to thank Mr. Baines and Chloe for organizing the event. On behalf of the NATO Association of Canada, I thank you for joining us today. Mr. Baines, do you want to say a last word before we go?
Just to thank you, Vincent. That was
my pleasure.
A great tour, and I think all three of our panelists gave us some terrific food for thought. So thank you to everybody. I would suggest that you stay engaged with us. The NATO Association is constantly pushing out to make sure that all Canadians understand the value of security, the importance of NATO, and the overarching dependence that Canada has on the rules-based international order. So thanks so much, Jim, Anessa, Darrell, Chloe, and Vincent. A great job, and we hope to see you all again soon for our next discussion. Cheers, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks.